Back in 1897, Victoria's Diamond Jubilee marked an incredible 60 years on the throne. It wasn't just a celebration. It was an absolute display of supreme confidence. She was the Queen of England, the Empress of India, presiding over an empire that stretched across the entire globe. But what was truly remarkable wasn't just the thousands pouring into London streets singing "God Save the Queen." It was the simple fact that the 78-year-old Queen was willing to appear publicly at all. For years, she was known as the Widow of Windsor, often shying away from public life, partly due to shyness, but largely because she was still in deep mourning. For 36 long years, she was the embodiment of grief itself. But behind that familiar image lies a story you haven't heard. Let's uncover what really happened. Don't let appearances fool you. Behind the widely known image of a grieving widow was a completely different truth. Victoria's marriage wasn't just a duty. It was a deep, profound love. Losing her beloved husband and her mother was a devastating blow. But it was also, unexpectedly, the start of a liberation process for a woman who had spent her entire life living under the shadow of dominant men. As a child and a young queen, she was nothing more than a pawn in political games. Prince Albert, the man she called her angel, even used her pregnancies to gain power and punish her for her discontent. But once she became a widow, despite her sorrow and moments described as mad, Victoria was finally free. Free to begin a lifestyle and forge relationships that would make the last 4 decades of her life arguably the most productive and fascinating. And luckily for us, she poured every single emotion onto paper. She wrote over 50 million words. Some of her writings were deemed so shocking by her own children that they were destroyed after her death. Our source's author, who read Victoria's unpublished diaries and letters, felt almost stunned by the passionate person hidden behind the image of the stout old woman in black, perpetually writing. Contrary to popular belief, she was often and easily amused. Now let's rewind to the very beginning. Victoria was never meant to be queen. She wouldn't even have been born if not for the tragic death during childbirth of her cousin, Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales. Charlotte was the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent, later King George IV. She was beautiful, gentle, loved by the people, and seen as the hope for the future. But in 1817, at just 21 years old, she died giving birth to her stillborn son. The entire nation plunged into deep mourning for the loss of Princess Charlotte and their potential queen. With no other direct heir in line, the uncles of King George IV were in a desperate rush. They quickly abandoned their mistresses to marry legally and raced to produce an heir for the British throne. The winner of this calculated breeding race was the 4th son, Edward, Duke of Kent. He married the German Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. And on May 24, 1819, they welcomed a baby girl. As the only surviving child of that generation, Victoria should have been incredibly precious to the royal family. But her uncle, the Prince Regent, was so bitter that he refused to give her a royal name like Charlotte or Augusta. Instead, he insisted she be named after her mother. Baby Victoria's father died of pneumonia when she was just 7 months old. This left the future queen to be raised by her controlling mother, who saw her daughter as nothing more than a meal ticket. The Duchess and her ambitious secretary, John Conroy, who was rumoured to be her lover, imposed a strict system of rules they called the Kensington system. Victoria had to sleep in the same room as her mother, wasn't allowed to walk up or downstairs without someone holding her hand, and was isolated from anyone deemed unsuitable, especially her paternal family. She was kept away from other children, rarely seeing her 2 older half-siblings. Her only friends were her dolls and her King Charles spaniel named Dash. The Duchess and Conroy claimed this system was to keep the precious future queen safe, but in reality, they wanted to raise her to be weak and submissive. They wanted her to be utterly dependent on them, making them the true power brokers in the country. King George IV died in 1830, and his successor was Victoria's uncle, William IV. 13-year-old Victoria became the heir presumptive. The Regency Act of 1830 stipulated that Victoria's mother would be regent if King William died before she turned 18. King William did not trust Duchess Victoria and publicly declared his intention to live until Princess Victoria was at least 18 years old. When Victoria was 15, her mother and Conroy began taking her on tours across the country to boost her popularity with the people. The constant public appearances exhausted the teenager, but her requests for rest were ignored. In October 1835, Victoria became severely ill with a fever. Conroy initially dismissed it as malingering, but when it became clear she was truly ill, he actually tried to bully the bedridden princess into signing a paper making him her private secretary and guaranteeing his power once she became queen. But despite her guardian's efforts, the teenage Victoria was tough as nails and flat out refused. This was one of the first glimpses of her incredible strength. Victoria's uncle, Prince Leopold, now King of the Belgians, was eager for the young princess to marry his nephew and her first cousin, Prince Albert. He arranged for Albert to visit 17-year-old Victoria in England. Victoria's paternal uncle, King William IV of England, disapproved of his heir forging closer ties with her maternal family and put forward a different candidate, Prince Alexander of the Netherlands. But the princess was completely unimpressed with Alexander, writing that she found him very plain. In stark contrast, Victoria wrote to her uncle Leopold expressing the greatest pleasure he had given her in the person of my dearest Albert. She praised him as extremely sensible, very kind and good and pleasant with it, and having the most delightful and amiable exterior and appearance. Victoria turned 18 in 1837, and less than a month later, William IV died at 71. She wrote in her diary, "I was awoke at 6 o'clock by Mamma, who told me the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham were here and wished to see me." She recounted how she got out of bed in just her dressing gown and was informed that my poor uncle the king was no more, and therefore she was the queen. Her very first act showed immediate independence. She demanded her own bedroom, separate from her mother's, and forbade John Conroy from ever appearing in her presence again. It was an instant liberation from the cruel Kensington system. Victoria had to propose to Albert herself, as it was considered improper for a man to propose to a reigning queen. The marriage was not very popular with the British public, as Saxe-Coburg and Gotha were seen as a small, poor and insignificant state. Their marriage and Albert's position were hotly debated in Parliament, but Victoria got her way, and the couple married on February 10th, 1840. At her wedding, Victoria started the tradition of brides wearing white. Before this, women simply wore their best dress, whatever the color. She wrote in her diary about their wedding night, describing my dearest, dearest Albert, and feeling a heaven of bliss and happiness I never imagined I could feel before. It was the happiest day of her life. The young couple was passionately in love. Albert was a stabilizing force for the Queen, who was often hot-tempered and prone to mood swings. He replaced Melbourne as her closest advisor, convincing her to be less partisan in her dealings with Parliament, thereby helping the development of Britain's constitutional monarchy. Thanks to Albert's mediation, Victoria's relationship with her mother also gradually improved. However, Albert's position was controversial. Victoria loved and trusted Albert deeply. She might even have let him become King Albert I, but the public did not trust the foreign prince. For the first 17 years of their marriage, he was styled His Royal Highness Prince Albert. It wasn't until 1857 when Victoria, tired of waiting for Parliament, officially granted him the title of Prince Consort. Victoria gave birth to 9 children. Albert was an exceptionally devoted father. Victoria was a little colder, disliked pregnancy and childbirth, refused to breastfeed, and likely suffered from postpartum depression after her births. Despite this, Victoria and Albert's family life was quite close and loving. Albert introduced the Christmas tree, a German tradition, to their family and to Britain. He designed and built family retreats to raise their children away from court life. Albert also oversaw the education of their children, teaching history, politics, literature, and languages. Victoria realized her traditional female-only education had not adequately prepared her for the work of state. So the royal couple decided that all of their children, both male and female, would receive a comprehensive education. Albert had a sharp financial mind and reformed the royal budget very effectively. He uncovered much waste and helped Victoria become profitable, ensuring wealth for future royal generations. Victoria's life was not without its challenges. She was shot at 2 more times in the 1840s and was struck on the forehead with a cane by a former army officer. The hostility against her largely stemmed from Ireland, which was suffering through the horrific potato famine. The famine killed over 1 million people. Rumours spread that she had only donated £5 to help the starving Irish, the same amount she supposedly donated to a dog shelter. But the reality was she had donated £2,000 of her own money to the relief effort, more than any other private donor. Yet the rumour persisted, and she was called the Famine Queen. In 1848, protests created a revolutionary scare, and the royal family had to flee to the Isle of Wight. However, calls for a republic eventually died down. The following year, the Queen made a public relations trip to Ireland, which somewhat smoothed over resentment but did not diminish rising Irish nationalism. 1861 was Victoria's worst year, her annus horribilis. The deaths of her mother and her husband completely devastated her. She fled London. In her delirium, she turned the man she had often resented and argued with, Albert, into a demigod. She wrote in her diary, "There is nothing I do without him, from the greatest thing to the smallest. My first thought was, I must ask Albert." What Victoria didn't realize at 42 was that marriage had infantilized her. She depended on Albert for everything, even choosing her dresses. He had reined her in and controlled her both politically and personally. And now his life was over, but hers wasn't. Gradually, she would find her wings and become free. The Queen was broken and spent the rest of her life in mourning. She popularized many mourning customs. She insisted that Albert's room be kept exactly as it was, and fresh clothes were still laid out for him every day. The Queen avoided public appearances and rarely set foot in London in the following years. This isolation earned her the nickname the Widow of Windsor. She coped with her grief by comfort eating, and her weight increased significantly, further adding to her reluctance to appear in public. During this period, she developed a special relationship with a servant named John Brown. Brown was her devoted companion and confidant for 2 decades. He spoke plainly to the Queen instead of flattering her like others, and he was able to pull her out of her depressions. The nature of their relationship has been the subject of great speculation. It was even rumored they were secretly married, but very little evidence has been found to prove this. It remains a historical mystery that sparks curiosity. The Queen's withdrawal from public life and royal duties led many to question why their taxes were paying for a queen who wasn't working for them. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The world had changed, and many believed the monarchy had no place. A Republican even hung a "To Let" sign on the gates of Buckingham Palace. Victoria slowly began to step back into the public light. Public sentiment improved after her son Bertie became seriously ill and recovered in 1871. In 1872, the Queen faced another assassination attempt while riding in her carriage. John Brown leapt from the carriage and grabbed the assailant, earning Victoria further public sympathy. Queen Victoria's children, now grown, married, many of those marriages bringing political advantage to the British Empire. Victoria loved all her children dearly. However, she could often be a little overbearing, interfering in their lives and marriages, even vetoing her children's romantic interests. In 1874, the new Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, saw the potential of the monarchy as a patriotic symbol for the expanding empire. He charmed and flattered the Queen. He drew Victoria back into the public light by proclaiming her Empress of India in 1876. Victoria viewed colonial conquest as civilizing and benevolent, protecting native peoples from more aggressive powers. She wrote, "It is not our custom to annex countries unless we are obliged to do so." However, our source also points out that she was blind to the injustices and brutalities of the colonial process. This offers a multi-layered perspective, showing the complexity in the views of a monarch reigning over a vast empire. In her final years, Victoria faced more loss. In 1878, her second daughter, Alice, died of diphtheria. 64-year-old Victoria fell down a flight of stairs, leaving her unable to walk for several months and suffering from rheumatism for the rest of her life. Her devoted servant John Brown carried her, but he also died 10 days after the accident, devastating the Queen. In 1884, Victoria's youngest son, Leopold, died at 30. In 1887, the empire celebrated Victoria's Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne, boosting her popularity and national patriotism. Victoria promoted a Muslim Indian servant, Abdul Karim, to be her munshi, teaching her Urdu. Her family and advisors complained that Abdul was taking a similar place to John Brown, but she dismissed their criticism as prejudice. Abdul remained by Victoria's side until her death. Victoria's grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, would later lead Germany into World War I against his British relatives in 1914. Victoria had been disappointed by his autocratic nature. In 1896, Victoria surpassed the record of her grandfather, George III, to become the longest reigning monarch in British history. The following year, the 78-year-old Queen celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on the throne, with a grand procession through London. Her carriage stopped outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and a service was held outside so the ailing Queen didn't have to climb the steps into the church. In 1900, her second son, Alfred, died. In the final days of 1900, while at Osborne House, Victoria began to feel weak and unwell. Her family was called to her bedside to say goodbye. She died on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Just before she took her last breath, she requested her beloved Pomeranian dog, Tudor, be placed on the bed. The details of her funeral are quite remarkable. Victoria was dressed in white, and her wedding veil was placed over her head. Inside the coffin were placed many family mementos. At the Queen's request, a dressing gown of Prince Albert and a plaster cast of his hand were placed beside her, and a lock of John Brown's hair and a picture of him were placed in her left hand, hidden from her family's view by a carefully positioned bouquet of flowers. This is a small but deeply touching and also curious detail. It reveals the Queen's deep and complex affections, extending beyond the official image. She was laid to rest beside her beloved Albert at the Frogmore Mausoleum. Queen Victoria's life is a story of power, loss, transformation, and complex relationships. From a tightly controlled princess, a dependent young queen, to a grieving widow who found liberation, and a powerful empress of a vast empire. Her story shows that appearances are often deceiving, and behind the historical symbols are real people with their own passions, struggles, and secrets.